So, without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker. So, our first speaker is Professor Luca Vigano. I will try to not get people's names incorrect. I will try as best as possible. Luca, I apologize beforehand. Luca is a professor at King's College, London, which some of you might have heard about. Small university somewhere abouts in London. Don't really know, but small university somewhere in London. And Luca's been talking to us about Cybersecurely Ever After. What fairy tales teach us about cybersecurity? Now, I bet, has anyone attended Impact last year? Let me just see by a show of hands. Now, last year we had some pretty interesting off-the-wall talks. Like, you wouldn't get talks like that at a normal conference. And this is not a normal conference. Luca's talk is a little bit like one of the ones we had last year. In that it's very, very, like, I guarantee it, you will probably never see a next presentation in your life that marries cybersecurity and fairy tales. I kid you not, I don't want to spoil Luca's talk, but Peppa Pig features in this presentation. So Luca's a professor in Department of Informatics at King's College London. His research focuses on formal analysis of cybersecurity and explainable cybersecurity. Now, another thing for this year that I want to ensure that things are super interesting for you is I have asked all the speakers to tell me something a little bit unique, a little bit fancy about themselves, a little bit special, a fun fact. And Luca's fun fact is interesting. So Luca's fun fact is Luca is actually also a professional playwright with plays produced and published, including by the National Theatre in Italy. How about that? In addition, on the not so fancy side, Luca has also had the pleasure of visiting jail as one of his students was in prison for murder. Oh, we need to prod him a little bit after, maybe in the next break to find out what happened there, right? Luca's session will be focusing on cybersecurity and fairy tales. The session is really about explainable cybersecurity, and it will look to discuss how fairy tales such as Cinderella, Alibaba, 40 Thieves, even Peppa Pig can be used to explain cybersecurity. So without further ado and me babbling on, let's invite Luca to the stage.
Thanks. Thank you all very much. Mic is working, yes. And I even get some water, nice. So let me see how I can screw it up with the clicker. Ellie, who has been doing a fantastic job, by the way, sorry to put you on the spot, but has briefed me, so let's see if it works. Yes. So, thank you, Jason. Thank you, CybeSafe, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I was in the audience last year and I was in the year before and everything, and I really enjoyed this conference. And let me start by asking you a question. It's a real question, so I'm hoping for answers. What is the earliest fairy tale that you remember? Because your parents read it out loud to you to lull you to sleep, your grandparents, or maybe you're using it now for your own kids. So, titles. Cinderella. Goldilocks. Snow White, Goldilocks, good. Little Red Riding Hood, there was another one that I didn't. Pinocchio, yes. Thank you. As an Italian, one of our contributions. I'm Italian, as you've guessed from my name and from my accent. I mean, it was easy. Well, we could continue. But the point is that whichever fairy tale it was, or it is, and here I've listed some of them, and in many cases taken the Disney version, or Pixar or whatever, but not always. Well, whichever fairy tales it was, it most likely contains some cybersecurity element. And that is my talk. That's what I'm going to tell you about. Now, of course, it's unlikely that in fairy tales they use smartphones and everything, although there are variants of that, obviously. So probably it will not be an explicit reference to cybersecurity, and it will more likely be implicit. But that is the point that I'm going to convince you about today, I hope. And why is that important? Well, it is important because cybersecurity is difficult. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't be here, right? Otherwise we wouldn't have companies and academics and other people working in cybersecurity. And by the way, I put cyber in parentheses because actually security is much more than just cybersecurity. So ideally we should call it information security because it doesn't necessarily need to have a computer or a network or a smartphone or whatever. But cybersecurity is a more fashionable word, so let's use it. But cybersecurity is difficult. And indeed, a few years ago, together with a colleague at King's called Daniele Magazzini, a fellow Italian, he now moved to the dark side. He is working for JP Morgan. And, well, he was the head of Explainable AI at JP Morgan, and we wrote a pamphlet paper, which is rapidly becoming one of our most cited papers. I mean, it's a short paper, nothing tremendously, worked out and rigorous and everything, but we wrote a paper called Explainable Security. And the point is, well, the reason is that we don't really do a good job at explaining security, and that is part of the reason why it is difficult. On the other hand, we don't do a really good job at explaining it because it is difficult. A few years ago, IBM made a survey, made a study in which they concluded that 95% of all successful cyber attacks are caused by human error. Now, it's not relevant if it is really 95% or 90 or 99. It's a really high number. But what is interesting for me is the question, whose fault is it really? Well, if you ask the machine will say it's a human error. But if you ask the human, in most cases, the human will say, well, it's a technical glitch. And you know what? In a sense, they're both right. So the first problem that we need to face is that users, and I'm talking about lay people, but not only, don't really understand security. And there are many critical vulnerabilities. I mean, you just need to open the news on an almost daily basis that stem from a combination of humans' ignorance, misunderstanding, inadvertent behavior, or even stubbornness. You know, I'm old enough to remember when the first phones came out. Not smartphones, phones. You know? And the phone was this thick. And you got it with a manual that was even thicker. These days, the phones are really, really slim, and there is no manual. And while it is true that devices are designed to be plug and play, usable immediately, actually we do lack the opportunity to explain to people how to use them. And the same applies also to applications and services, and I'll give you a couple of examples later. So problem number one is users don't understand security. Problem number two, and I am part of the problem, is that we security experts, don't really understand users. Okay? Because if you come from the formal world, one of the two worlds that I inhabit, what we typically do is we abstract away the users, and we divide our agents into, we focus on the attacker, and we assume that all the other ones are honest agents, behaving exactly like the programmers intended. So we have a very black and white view because the problem is difficult, and therefore it is easier to divide it in that way. But then when a problem happens, then we typically blame the user. And the reason is that we are not that good at considering the shades of gray in between black and white, but we should, because users are typically not attackers. Some of them are, but the vast majority are not. But they're also typically not honest agents in the sense that they're not going to behave exactly like the programmers intended them to behave. A typical example is if there is a button to be pushed, like there, some users will push it, some users will ignore it, some users will push it twice, some users will push the button to the right. And we need to factor that in. So what I've been doing in the context of explainable security, and I'll get to fairy tales in a second, is basically I've been working on two different topics. First, how do we explain security notions to users? But then, equally important, but maybe the subject of a talk next year, not today, how do we explain users to security experts so that they embed the users into their analysis? Now, I like to call the first one human learning, in explicit contraposition or juxtaposition to machine learning. Because it's great when machines learn, but we should not forget that humans should learn as well. And I like to call the second one learning humans, because we need to learn the way in which humans behave and interact with the systems. But as I said, I'm not going to focus on number two, I'm going to focus on problem number one. And my claim, and that's why I think using fairy tales is important, is that to explain security notions to users, we need to change the narrative and we need to change the language. And the reason for that is we have been doing it for ages. right? There are people like me, and I'm sure that there are many other people in the room. I know that there are a few people in the room who have been working on security awareness and all these things, but the problems are still there. So obviously, we're not doing everything right. We're doing a lot of things right, but not everything. So we need perhaps to find other ways, complementary, and not replacing what we're doing, but complementary to that. And just if you're interested, I've been working on a series of papers that I like to group under the name Cybersecurity Show and Tell. What I've been using, I'm a professional playwright, but also I'm the product of my parents, like most of us. So my mother still is, a computer scientist. My father was a movie and theater critic. So I became a computer scientist who writes plays or a playwright who does computer science. I'm not so sure, but I do both things. So I started with films and everything, but then, and I started doing this in my lectures because I find them very boring. I love to teach cryptography, but it's very, very dry. It's mathematics after mathematics, and you prove a theorem, and yes, it's... So I brought in movies and arts and the literature and everything, and what I found is that fairy tales are actually probably the most useful tool to do that, to change the narrative and to change the language. So let's do that. This is an excerpt of the webpage of TfL, Transport for London, in May 2023. And this is how the page looked like when they announced the move to multi-factor authentication. Now, I like TfL. I use them every day. I use them to come here. But look at what I've highlighted in yellow, right? So they're announcing an even more secure way to sign in. Great. Everybody likes security. Let's have more of that. Fantastic. But then they say, to strengthen the existing security measures, we're introducing multi-factor authentication. Okay, giving for granted that everybody knows what multi-factor authentication is. Now, I'm sure people in this room know. I'm counting on it. I'm not going to explain it. But if you actually talk to real users, most of them don't even fully understand the notion of authentication. If you talk to, not to the digital natives, but if you talk to senior citizens who are really even struggling to use a smartphone or even a credit card, they would struggle with that. And then there is something even more worrisome. While the upgrade is taking place, you will not be able to access your Oyster account and everything. So you're potentially creating a problem to people without telling them, actually, you know what, don't panic. This is under control. This is what it means. And this is how you can deal with it. So, and I've taken this as an example because it is one of the better examples. There are websites of banks or something like that introducing moves like this that are really, really problematic, but I'm not showing them because I don't want to be sued. But TfL, it's okay. So what could they have done better? Well, think about ways in which you can explain multi-factor authentication and why it is important. Let's change the narrative. Let's change the language. Somebody mentioned Cinderella. And Cinderella is interesting because Cinderella is a universal tale. It's one of the, not so few, but there are a few dozens of tales that are really, really universal. And I've stolen this picture from the web. And I've been using it, but I'm not 100% happy with it because it seems to suggest that in South America and in Australia and New Zealand, there was no Cinderella story. Actually, there are. Okay? Cinderella is a story that has about 700 certified variants, probably originating from China or from India, and then mediated through Italy, then France and Germany, so Perrault and the Brothers Grimm and everything, and then, of course, Disney. Okay. Now, what is interesting is let's not assume that everybody knows Cinderella. So what is the story? Cinderella lives with her parents. The mother dies. The father marries again to a woman who is also a widow. She has 2 daughters, and Cinderella and her father move to live with the stepmother and the stepdaughters. And at this point, in almost every version of the tale, father disappears. Not important anymore. I mean, for a number of reasons, he's on a business trip or whatever. So the stepmother and the stepdaughters basically use Cinderella as their slave. And she lives in the kitchen, she doesn't sleep in the bedroom, she sleeps by the ashes, hence the name Cinderella, by the cinders. In German, it's even clearer. It's Aschenputtel, the girl who lives by the ashes. In Italian, Cenerentola, the same thing. So anyway, to make a long story short, they live in a realm. The king has a son. The son needs to get married, so what better way to find a bride? Actually, we were talking about weddings earlier on. What better way to find a bride than to have a ball, 1 or 3, depending on which version of the story, in which the prince can choose his wife. So every maiden in the village is invited to the wedding. By some magic, Cinderella is not invited because nobody really knows about her, but by some magic, she manages to go to the ball. She's the prettiest of them all. The prince immediately falls in love. They dance all night, but at midnight, the magic ends, so Cinderella runs away. The only thing that is left is a glass slipper, which, by the way, is supposed to be a fur slipper, but by a mistaken translation, it became a glass slipper. If you think about it, it makes no sense to have a slipper made of glass, but fine. That's not for us to question, okay? So, a glass slipper. So, this is an excerpt from the Disney movie, and this is the proclamation. I'm sorry that it's not very readable in the back, but basically what this proclamation is saying is that emissaries from the king's soldiers, the Grand Duke and other soldiers will go and have every maiden in the realm try out the shoe, and the girl whose feet fit the shoe is going to become the princess. Now, I was probably a little bit of a nerd already when I was a kid, because I distinctly remember, and I've checked with my mom and she confirmed it, that I had a problem with this. I mean, let's forget all the problems about misogyny and all the, let's part them. But my problem was a technical one. How can it be that there is only one girl in the realm that has that shoe size? Right? Because that's the only way you can find one girl. And, either her feet are huge, possible, or her feet are really, really tiny, also possible. Actually, there are people who have written books about this. There is a fantastic book by Dolores, I forget the name, but I will tell you, who has written a book about fashion, in particular fashion in Cinderella. And actually the explanation is that in most versions of the story, the shoe is magical and recognizes the owner. But if you think about it, this is very, very interesting. And I've been told I should wait and then press play. Yes. Don't worry, there is no sound. This is a silent movie of 1912 by Georges Méliès, one of the fathers of cinema. And this is Cinderella. And basically what you can see here is that the soldiers, they're having every girl in the village, in the realm, try out the shoe. And of course, nobody fits. And again, the fact that the shoe is magical makes sense. Now, what are they doing? They're trying to identify, and identification is one of the key tropes in fairy tales. And if you think about it, it's one of the key tropes in our lives because it is authentication. They're trying to identify the mysterious girl. So they're trying to authenticate the mysterious girl. Obviously, they're trying every girl, not yet Cinderella, so nobody fits. Now, put yourself in the shoes of the stepmother. Okay, you don't know that Cinderella has gone to the ball because nobody knows. But what you know is you have 2 stepdaughters who are not that bright, not that pretty, but you would love at least one of them to become the princess. So what do you do? And you know their feet are not going to fit in the shoe. So one way to solve that problem is what the musical Into the Woods tells us, because it's very close to the original version by Perrault and Grimm. I'll let it speak. So one way is to masquerade the Cinderella, and now the shoe fits. But there is a masquerading attack. And that is actually something that can happen, because if you only have one authentication factor, it's actually possible that somebody can masquerade an attack. So it's better to have 2 authentication factors. And going back to Méliès, this is what happens in the 1912 film. because this is a continuation of the scene that we have seen before. They have tried every girl in the realm, but then they notice, oh, there is one more, and she's living by the ashes in the kitchen. So let's go and try her as well. And here we see our 1912 Cinderella, and they have her try out the shoe. The shoe has a cushion, pillow. She tries out the shoe, and now look closely what happens. I try to stay in the middle so that you can see the screens. She tries out the shoe, but could it be her? And she says, yeah, it's me. I have the second shoe. So, multi-factor authentication, you authenticate with different factors. Something that you have, something that you are, something that you know, something that you're able to do. In this case, the two factors are something that you are, the size of your feet, but also something that you have. You have the second shoe, which is something that the stepdaughters would never be able to have. So multi-factor authentication is great because it provides additional security. It also provides recovery in case one of the authentication factors fails or is not that strong, and Disney teaches us that.
Madam, my orders were every day. That's my child.
So the stepmother destroys one authentication factor. So how do you do authentication in this case if a password is weak or whatever? Well, so the second authentication factor can save the day, so you can have recovery. And let me stop here because I want to show you more. And this is an excerpt of my paper. I've written a paper, I'm writing a book and everything. But just to give you an idea, these are 16 fairy tales. I have a database of hundreds by now, and some cybersecurity notions. And you can see, it's not a complete table, but you can see there are a lot of bullets. So let me give you now a few more examples. I mean, multi-factor authentication, as I said, is pervasive in fairy tales because many fairy tales are about identity, right? About who you are and proving who you are. So for instance, you might be familiar with the wolf and the 7 young goats. Mother goat leaves the 7 children at home and tells them, don't open the door until you hear the sweet sound of my voice and see the white of my paws. The big bad wolf eavesdrops that, again, security notion, and so he eats some butter, he puts some flour on his paws, and the kids think that it is the mother, and they let him in. He eats 6 of them, the 7th one saved the day, of course. But it's even more present in our culture. Homer's Odyssey contains multi-factor authentication. When Ulysses returns home to Ithaca after 20 years, so 10 years at the siege of Troy and 10 years wandering through the Mediterranean, he's an old man. He even disguises not to be recognized. And nobody recognizes him except his dog recognizes him by his smell, authentication factor number 2. His old nurse recognizes him by a scar that he procured himself during a boar hunting accident when he was a kid, authentication factor number 2. And finally, Penelope, his wife, and Telemachus, his son, and Penelope's suitors recognize him by the fact that he is the only one able to bend the old bow of Ulysses and shoot an arrow through the head of 12 axes. Authentication factor number 3. Something that you are, something that you have, something that you're able to do. So authentication is so pervasive, and multi-factor authentication is so pervasive in our culture that people should actually not be scared by it. And we should not scare people into adopting it. We should tell them it is something that you are trying to think. I could do like Adrian Brody at the Oscars and say, it will be a very, very short talk, and then he went on for 5 minutes. But fine. So it's so pervasive that we make jokes about it. Let me give you an example. These are some new authentication factors. I don't know if your butt cheeks are unique, but maybe they are. So if it is so pervasive, why are we scared about it? And look, it's even in Peppa Pig. This is an episode called The Secret Club.
Hello, Susie. Hello, Peppa. Why have you got that mask on your face? So people don't know it's me. I'm in a secret club. Ooh, can I be in your secret club? Shh. It's not easy to get into. You have to say the secret word. What word? Flubber-double. Flubber-double? Right, you're in.
And then a little bit later, in the same episode, the following happens.
Can we join your secret club? It's very hard to get into. You have to say the secret word. Shalamakuki. Shalamakuki? That's not the word I said. It changes all the time to keep it secret.
So Peppa Pig talks about one-time passwords. Now, if, and this comes from a colleague of mine who rang me up and said, you need to watch Peppa Pig because I just watched this episode with my toddler and they have one-time passwords. So if we are able to make jokes about it, to tell stories, if authentication and other security properties are so part of our culture, then we already have the language. Okay? We just need to use it in the proper way. And there is more. I don't have the time, but Alibaba and the 40 Thieves is a gold mine for cybersecurity. I invite you to talk to me later or to read the paper, but it is about eavesdropping, it is about coercion, it is about forgetting a password, it is about anonymity, and a lot more. So we have that. So much so that everybody, somebody recognizes this? Snow White. What does the queen do? She talks to the magic mirror. She has a magic mirror in her house that tells them how things are. Basically, Alexa. Right? So I'll skip the video because I want to get to the key takeaways. Now, does it work? Right? So I'm having lots of fun in giving variants of this talk and everything. And as I said, I have written a paper, writing a book, and talking in schools and at conferences and everything. But I'm also a scientist, so does it work? So I've done a number of studies using both existing artworks and new artworks created on purpose. And we've done user studies to see, in particular, we use films because they're easier to do, especially online with Prolific for interrogating people in the user studies. But we did that, and the results show quite a significant improvement. Basically, we asked people, do you know what these notions are? Then we made them see a clip, and we asked the same question again, and we measured to what extent seeing a film improved their understanding. I've also been working with artists. So for instance, in particular, this is Alistair Gentry, who dresses up as a pink puppet pretending to be an AI. And we have interviewed people. And again, the results show a significant improvement. What is interesting, if you're interested in the pictures, is that sometimes you need a mediator. Sometimes you need somebody like me bridging the thing. But that's fine. There are people who are available to do that. What are the key takeaways? The key takeaways are that we are not really doing a great job. I mean, we're very good at improving the security of systems, but we're not, and we're very good at awareness raising and everything. But we are not always talking to people in a language that they can understand. And I'm not suggesting, okay, you tell them about fairy tales and that's it. That's not what I'm saying. But we need an icebreaker. We need a hook. We need to make people feel less scared. We need to tailor the explanations to what they know better. And they know much better fairy tales and films and literature than multi-factor authentication using your one-time pad and stuff like that. Okay? So there is proof that technical explanations can scare lay people. And as a consequence, their trust in the system and the explanation will diminish. And as a consequence, the trust in the system and in the security of the system will diminish. So instead, using a clear, simple explanation with something that they already know puts them in a much more comfortable position, much more receptive position, and then we can tell them something that is more technical if needed. Fairy tales help you to change the narrative and to change the language. So if you want to provide explanations to your users, you might want to do that. But there are other ways in which you can do it. Films are also a great way, although films are dangerous because from a narrative point of view, and here comes the playwright, in many films, because you need to convey the story very, very, very quickly, we have hackers who are basically superheroes or supervillains, right? So there is a famous film called Swordfish with Hugh Jackman and John Travolta and Halle Berry, and John Travolta is a bad guy, and he wants to force hire Hugh Jackman, who is a hacker, and gives him 1 minute to break triple desks with a gun pointed to his head and a woman disturbing him. And he does it, okay? And why does he do it? Well, because narratively, that's important, because you want to convey that he has knowledge that nobody else in the world would have. But we know that that is not real, okay? So films are a bit dangerous there, but there is a very, very interesting conversation that we can have. So you can explain cybersecurity, you can explain cyber risks, and given that I'm a playwright, I'll finish with this, shameless plug, but fine. I'm not getting any money for this. So I wrote a screenplay. I wrote a screenplay for a short film called The First, and the idea was, and we shot the film. The film was shot, it was produced by the National Gallery, by the UKRI TASAB, and by RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute Journal. And basically, this film is about the inverse Turing test. And so what would happen if, in the future, some jobs are forbidden to humans because they're too dangerous and they're done by machines? For instance, flying a plane. Now, what would happen if there was a human, in this case a little girl, who actually dreams of becoming a pilot? You would need to convince the machines that you're a machine so that you can fly a plane, which is exactly the inverse Turing test. And by the way, Philip Dick has done it before and much better than me, but fine, one tries, right? So, and we're using this film to actually talk about AI, but also to explore future scenarios and ask questions about law and identity and ethical judgment. And actually, if you think about it, that's exactly what fairy tales are for. They're entertaining, but they're also a way to think about the state of the world. It's a way for kids to learn. It's a way for adults to remember that at some point they were kids and they enjoyed reading them, but there is a lot more in fairy tales than just the sheer entertainment. Thank you.
Just kidding, John. Is there a roving mic? There should be a roving mic. I know you can shout, but there will be a roving mic. Yes, right here.
The gentleman with the orange T-shirt? Is it orange? Yes, it is orange. Sorry, I have a light shining in my...
Hi, my name's John Scott. I really hate your talk.
Good.
Because one of your conclusions is we're doing the wrong job. We are not explaining things well enough for people to understand. And I know at least half a dozen, maybe more than that, security awareness professionals who've been doing this for 10 years plus. So who's the we? Because if you mean techies, yeah, that's fine. They're rubbish at it. But there is, I'm really sorry, this is nothing new. Mm-hmm. We know that this works, and we know that it's effective, and we also know where it doesn't work. And I'll go back to your example of the button on the wall. The natural affordance of a button, what a button is designed to do, is be pushed. If you want me not to push a button, you don't need to tell me a fairy tale, you need to not have a button there.
Very good point. So I've been doing it for ages as well, and I don't think we're doing a good job. I think we have improved.
Sorry, but who's the we?
So I think, let me start with me. I think people like me who work on formal methods on one hand, but also work on security awareness, we are not really landing the explanations to the users, but also to the super users, to the companies, in such a way that they're really effective. Now, I totally agree with you. If you don't want a button to be pushed, don't put a button there. But in most cases, the button is there, and you have to live with it, right? Because somebody put it there. Well, I'm happy to disagree, and then we talk about security by design and everything. But think about the way systems work, right? Think about TfL. And in my view, we need to live with that. We cannot tell systems. So just let me give you a very concrete example from my other work. So I did work on mutations and human behavior and stuff like that. And one of the problems, for instance, is exactly what happens with TFL, with the fact that if you forget to touch in or to touch out, you're fined, right? And that is a bad design of the system, right? Because it shouldn't be the case. You should be forced to touch in and touch out, because otherwise you're fined. I've spoken with TFL, and they said, we don't care. We know that there is a faulty system. We know that we have implemented a faulty system, but we cannot change it. It's too late. We don't care. We will, by policy, company policy, refund, no questions asked, anybody who complains about it. But the reality is the system is faulty. So the reality is there is a button. Okay? Now, I would love to do security. I've had not tons, I've had a few projects on security by design, and that works, but it's not always possible. And then we need to teach people, actually, you should pay attention to touch in and touch out. And we need to teach people to really understand that they can become part of the solution. I'm tired of people saying you're part of the problem, or saying companies are part of the problem. Yes, they are, but we need to tackle the problem.
Okay. TFL do care when the number of refunds they have to do and the cost of doing those refunds start impacting their bottom line. They have made a risk-based assessment which said, we don't care enough. What you're doing is saying, let's put the burden on the end user. Actually, the right thing to do there is always claim. That is the right behavior, because it will fix the underlying problem.
Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying we should put the burden on the user. But users are keen to understand. And we can't talk to them in the way we would talk to TFL. We can't, and I'm talking not users in a company, right, where you can have security awareness training. I'm talking really about, and I've been doing that, talking to senior citizens groups who have absolutely no clue, who are scared to use a smartphone. And there, you need a different language. I'm talking about school kids. There you need a different language. So I find this fascinating. Can we continue the discussion later?
Yeah, thank you. Are there any more? Sorry, I'm sorry to cut you. Are there? Yeah.
Their question with, I hate your presentation. Do you want us to use that one now?
We just have, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to say that I loved your presentation.
Good.
And
so on average, I'm fine, right?
And thank you for sharing your stories with us. The question that I have is, how do you provide a narrative on a grand scale? When you're not talking to people inside an organization, when you're talking to the public at large, how do you get that story across to them to influence them?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure I know the answer. But I think we can find ways to explain stuff to people in a way that they reach it. So for instance, imagine going back to the webpage of TFL, they could have had a link to some page, to some explanation, to even a video of somebody explaining multi-factor authentication in different ways. And I'm not saying we should dumb down everything, right? So I'm a formal Methodist. I'm all in favor of formulas and proofs and theorems showing that this works. But having different languages and different ways to explain things, as long as they're compatible, and this is the danger, and I'll expand on this in a moment, so that they're compatible, that can help. How to reach the general public in a pervasive way, I don't know. Let me use the time to say something that I cut from the slides. This is fun, or at least I have a lot of fun, but it's also a bit dangerous, right? There is the danger of trivializing things, right? And that is a danger that we need to be very careful, because while it is true that you can break the ice in using arts and literature and fairy tales and everything, in most cases you cannot stop there. You then also have to give a more detailed explanation, a more serious explanation. Not serious is the wrong word, a less simple explanation. So there is a little bit of the risk of overdoing it. But. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Luca, and thanks everyone for your questions.